Okay, let's pray before we start our time in the Word. Father, as we come now to the study of your Word about your Son, specifically about your Son, I ask that you help us just to have our minds open, our hearts open, and our ears open, just so that in all ways we are paying attention to these things. And I ask that you help me especially, just as I try to bring them out and speak clearly and in a way that very much addresses the consciences of your people and will help to just lead us all onward in imitating Christ and learning such things as he would have us learn. So please help us in this. We are dependent entirely on your Holy Spirit. Apart from his work in our hearts, we will not accept these things, we will not understand these things, and we certainly won't live them out. So we again submit ourselves and humble ourselves and seek you for our own good and seek you for your glory as well as we try to live in such a way that's becoming of your kingdom. And we ask these things in Christ's name. Amen. All right. Well, we are still making our way through the 7th section of Matthew's Gospel, which is going to be the final 3 chapters of Matthew's Gospel, so 26, 27, and 28. This being the capstone of everything Matthew's been doing throughout his entire book. And in section 7, we see that Jesus, with sovereign humility, is murdered on the cross for the forgiveness of our sins and is resurrected in victory to inherit God's kingdom. So this is, the heart and the centerpiece of the gospel. This is everything Jesus came to do. This is everything upon which we rely for our salvation. And as we go through this, of course, I have this section divided into portions as part of my outline, and we're in the second portion of all of this. And in this portion, we begin to see Christ subjected to humiliation as he is arrested and abandoned and put on trial. So this is, him, becoming a man. Just that is certainly a humiliation for him, being the Son of God. But now it's like living out the worst kind of humanity you could live out, just being absolutely subjected to all the harm and all the debasement that the rest of humanity can dish out, which is quite a lot, and he is going to bear the brunt of that. And so this is an even greater humiliation than what he has experienced so far, just as in his time as being a man. And just again to remind you how I understand humiliation in this case as it regards to Christ. Humiliation means being treated worse than you deserve or worse than you think you deserve, to the point that it causes you great sorrow and great shame. And of course, in Jesus' case, we know he does not deserve to be treated in any of the ways he's about to be treated. And so his sorrow and his shame in that sense are the purest form, in that they're not caused by any kind of misguided pride or anything like that. He really is worthy of much more, and he is being treated so far below what he is worth. So that is what he is undergoing for our sakes in this portion of Matthew. Now, as we study his humiliation, we've come to chapter 26, verse 36 through verse 46. And this passage shows us what happened in the Garden of Gethsemane. So this is really his last time kind of with his disciples before he is actually taken away, and the things that happen there just before he's arrested. Let's go ahead and read this again. This is Matthew 26, verses 36 through 46 again. So let's go ahead and read this. So then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And he took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee and began to be grieved and distressed. Then he said to them, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me." And he went a little beyond them, and fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping, and said to Peter, "So you men could not keep watch with me for 1 hour. Keep watching and praying that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He went away again a second time and prayed, saying, "My Father, if this cannot pass away unless I drink it, your will be done." And he came and found them sleeping again, for their eyes were heavy. And he left them again and went away and prayed a third time, saying the same thing once more. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hand of sinners. Get up and let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand." And I've delivered 2 sermons on this passage already. The first one focusing on the cup, and the second one on the prayers of Jesus. So we focused on what Jesus means by this cup and what we can learn from that, and then also from Jesus' praying and why he prays the way he does, and insights we can glean from all of that. That leaves one more thing to do in this passage before we can move on from it, and that's going to be the topic of my final sermon on this passage. Today I want to focus more on the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane. So we're going to focus specifically on Peter, James, and John, who were the 3 that were very much more with him, in that he deliberately brought them with him further into the garden. And so on that topic, we're going to call this a helpful humiliation, which is my title for this sermon, a helpful humiliation, thinking of them being humiliated by events in the garden. So Jesus isn't the only one being taken down several notches. Peter, James, and John are going to as well. And my point today is that Jesus uses his own humiliation as an occasion to correct his disciples, because they are, of course, in need of much correcting, and there's going to be some final lessons here before Jesus actually gets arrested. And he's taking that occasion to show them a few more things that he has not yet shown them as powerfully as he can now. So my outline today has 5 headings, which I'll review for you so you can see where I'm going with all of this. First, just want to make the point that the garden is a place of potential sin and proven righteousness. And if that seems a bit cryptic or a little bit beyond what we're actually doing in this passage, you'll see what I mean when I actually get there. Secondly, Matthew portrays a contrast between a humiliated but resolute Jesus and boastful but weak disciples. So as you compare the 2 sets, Jesus on one side, the disciples on the other, they are different from each other in ways that are ironical with regard to each of them, very ironic. And then thirdly, in the garden, Christ was further humiliated by unhelpful disciples. So we kind of see, maybe worth noting, how Jesus' sorrow and shame are made worse by his friends not playing the part of friends very well at this particular time. And then fourthly, as Jesus prays, he also helpfully humiliates those same 3 disciples. And this, of course, is where we're getting more to the point of today's sermon, and actually the effect of these things on them, and how Jesus intended these things to come across to them. And then finally, the humiliation of the disciples reinforces the necessity of prayer, which, if you're looking for your so what for today, that's it. This all underscores the necessity of prayer as a Christian. Now, up until his last moment with his followers, before his arrest, Christ is still making every effort to shape these men into what they needed to become. So the work of a teacher never ends, and Jesus knows that, and right up until his last moment with these men before his ultimate suffering, he is still working on them and their souls. And in this passage, we often focus on the gigantic effort of Jesus to prepare himself to accept God's wrath. That's very much the centerpiece, and my 2 of my 3 sermons on this passage are about him and what he's doing, and that's all fair. But let's not forget that it is easier to keep a righteous man righteous than it is to make sinful men pure. So if we're talking about where the most strenuous effort is directed in this passage, it is actually at Jesus' continuing work on his disciples, who are not near the caliber of Jesus, and therefore have a much further way to go to being Christ-like. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus has therefore added a titanic effort on top of his already a gigantic one by using this occasion to teach. So he has made things much more difficult on himself, as he's already feeling the burden of a world of sin on him and the wrath of God beginning to come upon him. He is still making it more difficult on himself by continuing to do what he can for Peter, James, and John in particular. So this truly amazing deed of Jesus during these events was bringing those three men a little closer to holiness while he was nearly dying of grief. Just to further emphasize how amazing it is that Jesus is still trying to be a shepherd for his flock at this time, that even while he is already beginning the process of dying, as he words it, he is still trying to show them the way. So let's explore this often ignored accomplishment of Jesus in the garden a little further throughout today's sermon. So I began with the comment that the garden is a place of potential sin and proven righteousness. And I admitted that was a bit of a cryptic way of saying that, so I will tell you what I mean here as my first heading for today. And before I get too far ahead of myself, I want to prove, because I don't think I've done so, that Gethsemane is in fact a garden. We call it the Garden of Gethsemane, but why do we call it the Garden of Gethsemane? Well, as we often must, we need to put all four of our Gospels together to see the full story of this event and see why we call it the Garden of Gethsemane. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we're going to combine their observations. Luke's Gospel does not mention Gethsemane by name, but only says that Jesus went with his disciples to the Mount of Olives at this time, which is just to the southeast of Jerusalem, across a bit of a ravine that's there, the Mount of Olives. So very familiar location. So then that's what Luke says. Matthew and Mark, however, name a specific place on the Mount of Olives called Gethsemane as the scene for these prayers and the arrest of Jesus. We've seen that in Matthew's Gospel. Mark's Gospel is very similar to Matthew here, so we don't really need to turn there, but they both name it Gethsemane. Now, the name Gethsemane is Aramaic, which is the language spoken by most Jews at that time and in that place. So that's kind of their language at this particular point in history. And the name Gethsemane refers to an oil press, so where you actually make oil by pressing olives and getting the olive oil out of it. So if you were to harvest olives from the Mount of Olives, you might bring them to Gethsemane, the oil press, to make them into olive oil. So it all makes sense so far in terms of this placement of this particular Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives. And honestly, that fact by itself that I just said seems very fitting for what Christ is facing at the moment and what's about to happen, because now the pressure is on, right? He's feeling it more than ever before. He's being pressed down like olives in an olive press, so it's very fitting that Gethsemane is the place where this all starts. Nonetheless, we have not yet seen any evidence that Gethsemane is actually a garden in any sense of the word. So for that, we have to go to John's Gospel. John's Gospel does say that the arrest of Jesus occurred at a garden. And if you want to fact check me on that, that's John chapter 18. I think he uses the word garden a couple of times in there, but this is a garden, okay? So all things considered, it's fair to say that Gethsemane was not just an olive press, but an entire garden on the Mount of Olives, just outside of Jerusalem. So that's putting all that together. That's why we call it the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, it's worth remembering, if you're trying to recreate this scene in your mind, as many people do, it's worth remembering that gardens in that time and place were not merely patches of land where you plant tomatoes and things like that. Our view of a garden is something we keep in our backyard because we want to grow food and things like that. Gardens in those days were more like city parks. These were larger areas, much more deliberately made and usually open to far more people. If you've been to the botanical gardens, for example, that's even closer to what gardens were in the ancient world. There are these larger places where you can go and see all these different kinds of plants. They're almost always surrounded by walls. They're usually some kind of walled enclosure, and inside you're going to find trees and plants that are being grown, not just to harvest food, but also for appearance, right? It's very much for the aesthetic, for the idea of creating something very beautiful that people can come in and marvel at. It's very much that kind of idea, which is why I liken it also to maybe a city park, because people go there and hang out because they like to be there. But botanical gardens are even more accurate for what we're dealing with the Garden of Gethsemane. So that is the scene as Jesus draws aside with his disciples for prayer before he is arrested. And this is the place that Christ has chosen for his arrest to happen. Because remember, he came here knowing what was going to happen. So this is the place that he chose for the beginning of his final stretch in his ministry. So as we consider this passage, we can say that all of history and all of mankind and the entire plan of God can be summarized under two gardens, right? The Garden of Eden and the Garden of Gethsemane. Like we can actually create these bookends, if you will, for all of history, and they're both gardens, beginning and end. In the Garden of Eden, mankind faced a test of obedience to God, which was both our first and worst, given the outcome. It did not go well. It was the first challenge that God laid down for us as a way to prove that we are really following him, and we absolutely failed in the most titanic way possible. Just absolutely failed that test. When Adam and Eve sinned, all mankind was condemned as wicked and worthless. It was proof that there is something lacking in us, that we are not, in fact, so cast upon God as to be completely above temptation. And on that note, the guilt of Adam was very much attributed to all of us because we all come from him, and he was the representative. He was the best of us, the very best example of mankind that God could have made right then and there, and he failed, and therefore we are all, subject to that same condemnation. But now in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus faces a new kind of test, but with very similar stakes. There's not a tree there that he is forbidden to eat from. There's not anything like that. It's a very different kind of temptation overall. Nonetheless, the stakes are similar because failure at this moment will Does anyone want to check what's going on out there? I don't know. Almost sounded like an animal, but I don't know. I'm hearing it over in that direction. Coyote. Okay. Gotcha.
That's what I thought. I was like, what in the world? Like, I'm looking and I'm like,
Okay.
for everybody.
Okay. Yeah. That's okay. They're fine. They run away from people. I've seen a couple in my neighborhood. So. Yeah. Okay. I'll simmer down. We're gonna get back to it if there's no. All right. Possibly. I just didn't know if it was something a little more important. So, but yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. So I wanted to just make sure there's nothing happening outside of our doors. But anyway, all right. So going back to it, the Garden of Gethsemane, in contrast to the Garden of Eden. So different kind of test, but similar stakes. Failure at this moment, if Jesus fails to do what he has been charged to do, what he came to do, if Jesus fails, it will finalize the fate of mankind as sinners to be destroyed under the wrath of God, which is that's the trajectory that Adam set us on by his sin. But if Jesus passes this test and is obedient to the death, he will have purchased redemption from sin, despite our own earlier failure. It will actually change the course of humanity. It will change the results of the previous test in the previous garden and actually put us on much better footing. So gardens, as you think about it, are places where life can flourish, but only with effort and attention. No garden just grows. Even the smaller gardens that we keep require our constant effort to make sure that they are growing and thriving. Otherwise, the place becomes a place of decay instead of a place of life. It becomes a place of death. And so it is here in Gethsemane on the night when Jesus went there. This is a place where he is trying to cultivate life, eternal life for sinners in the place of the death that we had through Adam. So that is the scene, the real scene, not just the garden, but all that it signifies as Jesus is making himself ready for his death. With that in mind, we can direct our focus to Matthew's contrast between a humiliated but resolute Jesus and boastful but weak disciples. So that's the contrast. On one hand, we have a humiliated but resolute Jesus, and on the other side, we have boastful but weak disciples. And I attribute this contrast to Matthew simply because he seems to care more about the disciples in the garden than the other three Gospels care about the disciples in the garden. And this just comes from comparing the four Gospels to each other, as I often do. Among the four Gospels, Matthew often records, if you want to think of it this way, Matthew often records more events than the other three Gospels, but he also tends to include less detail about those events. I don't know if you've ever noticed that as you've compared the Gospels, but Matthew seems to record more events, but with less detail about each of them. And this trend is often true for Matthew, both in the book as a whole, but also in any given passage. So you can apply that to the overall book, his method of writing, but also any given passage kind of follows that same mentality there. More events, but less detail. Now, in the account of events at Gethsemane, Matthew portrays everything very quickly and with very little detail. Jesus prays, talks to the disciples, prays again, visits the disciples again, prays again, comes back one more time, boom, 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 boom. Matthew just moves through all of that in these like bullet points. It's very common for Matthew. However, it's also worth saying that Matthew has also written the only gospel which records all of that, all three things. So 3 times at prayer, 3 visits to the disciples. Everyone else is not recording every single one of those events that take place. So he might be doing it in very abbreviated form, but he has crammed everything into his passage here as he relates it. And all of that tells me that Matthew in particular really wants you to keep your eye not just on Jesus, but also on the disciples and how Jesus deals with the disciples at this time. Because Matthew keeps bringing you away from the prayers of Jesus, back over to the disciples, and then back to Jesus, back to the disciples, back to Jesus, back to the disciples again. He really wants you to be thinking about these two groups, Jesus over here and then the 3 disciples over here. He wants you to be comparing them as he goes through his passage. And in doing so, Matthew shows us a great contrast between Jesus and his disciples. Because as we compare them, we realize the two are not the same. They are not acting in the same way in this time of, great moment, in this momentous occasion here. Jesus begins in grief and distress. He tells us that. He tells us that even his grief is even so great that he feels like he's on the point of dying. And that in itself is quite an observation to note about Jesus. Matthew includes possibly no references throughout his gospel to how Jesus feels at any given point. I wanted to say that Matthew includes no references at all, but just in case I can't remember one of them that I've forgotten somehow, I'm just going to say practically no references or possibly no references. The fact is, Matthew's gospel does not focus at all on how Jesus feels at any given moment. Mark, Luke, and John often note the emotions of Jesus, but Matthew pretty much doesn't. This could be the first time we see Jesus show emotion at all in Matthew's gospel. So it must have been bad if even Matthew is noting, hey, he's really broken up at this point. This is just terrible for him. And yet, we see the effect of drawing near to God for Jesus, because that, after all, is what Jesus is doing in his time in Gethsemane. He is praying. He is drawing near to God. Jesus goes from hoping to escape the plan, to accepting the plan, and then to embracing the plan, being ready to be arrested that night and die the next day. We see him become more resolute as the passage goes on. Meanwhile, the disciples are given two instructions: watch and pray. Okay? And just that's it. I mean, that's their only job. Stay awake and keep praying. You know, two things that they should be able to do, but they fail at both by falling asleep. They are passed out, all three times Jesus comes to see them. And after Jesus rebukes them, they fail again so badly that Jesus does not bother waking them up again until the very end. He just lets them sleep. So this contrast between the one man and those three men is very great in terms of what they are doing and how they are dealing with this occasion. The contrast is even greater given that the three men chosen by Jesus to attend him at this time kind of have a history. They have a bit of a history for, in some way, shape, or form, shooting off their mouths and making themselves out to be a bit more than they really are. Peter has just boasted in the previous passage, he just boasted that he would never deny Christ, even if everyone else did, and that he would die with Jesus. So Peter thinks he is up to that task. Whatever, but the hardest challenge that he can imagine, he can meet that challenge. That's how Peter thinks of himself. As for James and John, these two men had, several days before, requested that they be seated at the right hand and left hand of Jesus in his kingdom, professing that they could drink the same cup he was going to drink. Now, they don't understand a whole lot, but they think that whatever Jesus is going to do, we can do that. And we're worthy to sit at his right hand and his left hand in his kingdom. So they think that of themselves. So where is all their boasting now that these men cannot even stay awake to pray? What right do they have to boast about anything? Jesus gave them two instructions. They fail at both, and they're sleeping at a time when he specifically told them to do two things in particular. Peter, James, and John are men of talk. Right? Christ is a man of steadfast righteousness, even if he flinches a little bit before the hammer falls. So Jesus is maintaining, to some degree, his composure and his dedication to doing what God has told him to do. Peter, James, and John are sleeping, contrary to orders. And in this way, Matthew provides a contrast between the humiliated but resolute Jesus and these boastful but very weak disciples. With that, we can move on a little bit further and take a closer look at that contrast, because I'm not quite done with it. My third heading is still very much on that same topic. Let's focus on how Christ was further humiliated by his unhelpful disciples. Let's talk about how the conduct of the disciples at this time just kind of add to the burden that's on Jesus and add to his shame and his sorrow, as I've put it, in talking about his humiliation. None of the disciples went to that garden for the purpose of adding shame and grief to Jesus, but they did. Their actions were very much a grievous thing to him, I think. And to help you see this, I want to ask and answer a question. Why did Jesus bring the disciples with him to the garden? Let's focus on that question for a little bit. Why did Jesus bring the disciples with him to the garden? As we know, they ultimately do nothing, so they don't need to be there, but Jesus brought them there anyway. And in all fairness, they weren't meant to do anything. Jesus doesn't want them to fight for him or anything like that. So no matter how you address this, they don't have to be there. So why did Jesus bring them there? Specifically, why keep those three men so close to him? Why Peter, James, and John? So you bring all the disciples there with you to the garden and then single out these three men to be even more with him than the others at this time. Why do that? Well, at first we might reply, Jesus brought them there to pray for him or to pray with him, to kind of join him in this time of prayer that he plans to have as he approaches his death. Well, Jesus does tell them to pray. We've seen that. That is absolutely the thing they were supposed to be doing. However, Jesus does not say to pray for him. At no point in the passage do we see him request that of them. He doesn't tell them to pray for him. In fact, he only tells them to pray so that they do not enter temptation. If they're praying for anybody, it's more like they're praying for themselves. They're praying for their own benefit. He's not asking them to pray for him. He's asking them to pray for them, if nothing else. That makes it sound like the disciples are supposed to be praying for themselves rather than for Jesus. Also, let's not forget that the disciples have no idea what is happening in that garden. They are, as they often are, not very much aware of what the actual plan of God is. This whole thing with the Messiah dying and rising again, they kind of think it's a parable. They don't really get what's about to happen. And if they are ignorant, how can they pray? How can they pray effectively if they literally have no idea what's going on? The only other command Jesus gives these men is to keep watch or stay awake, depending on your translation. Different translations take it different ways, and they're very similar ideas anyway. But why keep watch? Why stay awake? Jesus has no plans to run away, so he does not need lookouts to warn him of enemies approaching. He doesn't plan to fight, so this isn't like soldiers on guard duty or anything like that. Why have them stay awake? Why have them keep watch? Again, we come back to these questions. Why did Jesus bring his disciples here? I think we can give two answers to that question, and I do plan to give both answers, but for now I'm just going to focus on one. I'll come back to the other later. Jesus brought the disciples to the garden to be a comfort to him in his distress. I think that's one of the reasons that they are there, to be a comfort to him in his distress. Now, in giving that answer, I'm just appealing to human nature. There's no precise statement of Scripture to that effect. But taking what I know about humanity and my knowledge that Jesus is a human, I'm assuming that he wants them there partially, at least, for his own comfort. Most people want people who love them near them when they suffer, for the emotional support. Right? We actually want somebody with us who can be sympathetic, maybe who can say the kind words, or just to be there. Sometimes we don't even want them to say anything. We just want them to be there. It's very common. And this night is certainly the most grievous night of Christ's existence. This is where it is all really coming to bear on him. He has had up until this point a theoretical understanding of what it means to bear the wrath of God for the sins of the world. Now he's actually starting to feel it. And if Luke's gospel is to be followed, I think it's Luke's gospel, he's like sweating drops of blood at this point. So it is really coming down on him. And Christ, although he is the Son of God, is also a human, fully human, and subject in all ways to human weaknesses, and therefore also craving human comforts. Whatever weaknesses you have, there are certain comforts that you seek for those weaknesses, and Jesus is going to be no different. Therefore, I suggest that Christ brought the disciples to the garden to be a comfort to him in his distress. They are to be the friendly faces, the last friendly faces he's going to see before he gets arrested and taken off to die. And he wants them there for that reason. So he brought them there to the garden, I think, at least partially to be a comfort to him in his distress. All they have to do to fulfill that role for him, the only thing they have to do is stay awake. They don't even technically have to be praying. They're praying for themselves. For Christ's sake, that doesn't really matter. He just needs them to stay awake so he knows they're there and they are with him. But of course, the disciples entirely fail Jesus at this time in that they do not stay awake. Instead of providing Jesus with some small relief in the form of close friends nearby, they sleep and they sleep again. And after that, he just lets them sleep because he knows they're not going to be able to do this for him. I would like to read you a passage from Psalm 69. If you are wanting to turn there, you can. We'll just be there briefly. But this is Psalm 69. This psalm is sometimes quoted in the New Testament and applied to Jesus. So that makes it a messianic psalm, a psalm that is in some sense about the Messiah. It's about Jesus. So we bear that in mind as we read this portion of it. And I really just want to read verses 19 and 20. Verse 19. So the psalmist speaking to God, and you can imagine Jesus saying this, "You know my reproach and my shame and my dishonor. All my adversaries are before you. Reproach has broken my heart, and I am so sick. And I looked for sympathy, but there was none, and for comforters, but I found none." He's looking for comforters, and he doesn't find any. He brought some with him. They fell asleep. And from that, you can see that Jesus did indeed desire, in some sense, sympathy and comforters during his distress. That's probably the closest thing I can give you to an actual biblical quote to prove what I'm saying to you right now, beyond just appealing to human nature. It seems like he did indeed desire, in some sense, comfort and sympathy at this time. And he looked for it in his disciples, but he found none. They weren't there for him in his time of need. You know, he's not asking them to fight or anything. He just wants them to stay awake and be there with him. But nope, they can't do that. And this is why I say that Christ was further humiliated by his unhelpful disciples. This shame and this sorrow that he's experiencing at this time is made just that much more worse by his own guys just not being there for him. Most people have someone who loves them to stand by them in their worst moments. Like even people who create all of their own problems and just pull everything down on their own heads. They usually have somebody who loves them and cares about them and will go get them if they're in trouble somewhere, who will do something to help them out of the hole they dug for themselves. Most people have that. We live in a world where mothers attend the courtroom trials in which their children are being found guilty of murder, right? We have things that extreme, things that bad. People in a hospital or a nursing home usually have visitors, people that come to see them and try to cheer them up in some way. We have all of that. But as for Jesus, he bears the reproach and the shame of a man about to be truly abandoned, both by God and by man. God's going to forsake him for all the reasons that we know about dealing with sin and bearing the punishment for it. But also now men are forsaking him. His friends for the past 3+ years are forsaking him in this kind of gentle way of just like falling asleep and not doing as he asks. So this definitely is adding weight to the shoulders of Jesus as he is preparing to die for the sins of the world, furthering his humiliation at this time. Now, I hinted a few minutes ago that Jesus had a second reason for bringing the disciples with him. I said there were 2 reasons he brought the disciples with him. The first one was just to be a comfort to him, but I said there was a second one. The second reason forms the other half of this contrast that Matthew has portrayed between Jesus and his disciples. So we're still comparing the 2 men, just now in a bit of a different, or the 2, Jesus and the other men, I should say. We're still comparing them and contrasting them just in a bit of a different way. Here is the second reason Jesus brought the disciples with him. As Jesus prays, he also helpfully humiliates those same 3 disciples. Now, I've just played it up to just how bad it is for the disciples to not be there for Jesus and the effect that would have on him. But to some degree, he knew that and knew that these men needed to have this experience. And so, yeah, it's a terrible thing viewing it from Jesus' perspective, but Jesus also sees this as a teachable moment, and he's going to make use of it. And he's going to make use of it to give them a little bit of humiliation as well and take them down a few notches in the way that they need at this time. Now, at the risk of making Jesus sound a little spiteful, I insist that he is doing these men a favor. Usually when one person humiliates another person, that's usually not good. But in the case of Jesus doing this for his disciples, we're dealing with men that actually need to be humiliated a little bit, and Jesus is doing them a favor by doing this. On the one hand, I do think that Jesus intends to shame these men. They are supposed to be a bit downcast after all these events, and they're supposed to go home and think about these things very carefully with all the shame that introspection usually brings. And at first, that may seem like a petty thing to do in giving them a taste of their own medicine, so to speak. But against all that, I think Jesus teaches them a lesson which they need to learn. As I implied earlier, all 3 of these men need to be taken down from their pride and presumption because they all have it in some measure, and they need to be reminded that they are not as high and mighty as they think they are. Peter has just boasted in the previous passage that he would never deny Christ, even if everyone else did, and that he would even die with Jesus if he had to. He has proclaimed that he has loyalty above and beyond the loyalty of anyone else, including the other disciples, which is quite a boast. As for James and John, these 2 men had, as I said, several days before, requested to be seated at the right hand and left hand of Jesus in his kingdom, saying that they could drink the same cup he was going to drink. Anything you can do, Jesus, I can do, and I deserve to be up there with you, reigning in your kingdom. That's their mentality. With that in mind, how does Jesus convince these three men that they are not the big shots they think they are? How does he prove to them that they are not these great men of God that they think they are at this time? Well, the answer is he gives them a simple task, and when they fail, make sure they know it. Easy. And with this bunch of people, it's not hard, right? I mean, it's the disciples. I mean, they're usually much better at failing than they are at succeeding. And so I think Jesus knows that and plays into it. Jesus does not ask them to die for him. He does not ask them to suffer alongside him. He doesn't even ask them to feel what he's feeling. Like, he doesn't do any of that. All he tells them to do is stay awake and pray. Two very simple things. The first task is something they do for 2/3 of every day. Like 2/3 of every day you are awake. Surely you can pull that off on this occasion, right? The second task is something they have been taught to do from childhood, assuming that they are, good, typical synagogue-attending Jews, which they probably were. I mean, they've been taught to pray from the very beginning. And yet, all three men fail at both tasks. They don't stay awake, they don't pray. They fail at these very simple things. I just wanted to jump over for a minute and read Luke 16, verse 10. This is something that Jesus said on a different occasion, but I think it applies here. Jesus said this, "He who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much. And he who is unrighteous in a very little thing is unrighteous also in much." All right, so with that in mind, what does that say about these allegedly great men who fail at such little things, as staying awake and praying? What does it say about Peter, James, and John? Well, they're not going to be faithful in much if they can't be faithful in little. And Jesus shows them that here and now. And true to form, Jesus especially calls out Peter for these failures. He does this somewhat often, and Peter has probably learned to expect it to some degree. But Jesus does that. He specifically calls out Peter at this time. Just looking at verse 40 here. "And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping, and said to Peter, 'So you men could not keep watch with me for 1 hour.'" Like, he knows that all three of them are somewhat to blame, but he still calls out to Peter in particular, "Hey, shouldn't you be the one keeping these other two awake? Why shouldn't you be the one leading them in prayer? Shouldn't you be the one keeping all this going?" He calls out Peter in particular, probably due to his more recent boast, if not his ordinary role as representative of the disciples, because he usually is. He usually is chiefest among them, and so that would also be a reason to do that. But he also did make the biggest boast most recently, and so probably it's fresher in his mind, and maybe he's now a little more, he would be a little bit more jarred by seeing his own failure at this time. So perhaps that's also a reason. And of course, we shouldn't forget that, Peter, he was boasting earlier that he's going to be ready to fight, right? He's going to stand with them. And, if he's going to be ready to fight, shouldn't he be staying awake? Shouldn't he be actually awake enough to fight if that time comes? And let's not forget also just one final thing. This is a foreshadowing of Peter's 3 denials, right? He's going to deny Jesus 3 times. He's going to deny 3 times that he even knows Jesus. And in keeping with that, we have 3 failures to stay awake and pray. 1, 2, 3. So he's kind of giving him, Peter did not react to that news well. Jesus told him, before this night's over, before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. And Peter said, "Oh no, that's not going to happen." Well, Jesus shows him in kind of this soft way 3 failures right here and now. Letting him know, "Hey Peter, look, what I told you is going to happen. Look, you're kind of doing it right now. You're kind of failing right now. So get your head in this, because this is going to happen." But I insist, after all of this, after how grueling all of this seems, that this is a kindness from Jesus to his disciples, right? They really do need this. And again, I want to jump back to a psalm and just read something very briefly from Psalm 141, verse 5. Here's this: "Let the righteous smite me in kindness and reprove me. It is oil upon the head. Do not let my head refuse it." So what does the righteous man say? It's if you're a righteous man, hit me. Hit me hard. I want you to hit me as hard as you can. Like that's the mentality that a righteous person has toward other righteous people. We want the rebuke of other righteous people because that's how we learn. Jesus might be rubbing their noses in their shortcomings, but the disciples need to see those shortcomings. They need to see that they are not up here. They need to see that they're down here in terms of holiness. And after all, we can only improve when we know what we need to improve. And the same is true for spiritual growth as well. Like you can only deal with a problem if you know it's there. And now these men know they have another problem that they have to deal with, but that gives them the knowledge they need to actually persevere and become the kind of men they are meant to be. Therefore, Jesus has orchestrated this whole thing to bring them to this place and keep them there to humiliate them in the most helpful way possible and therefore engender greater growth later as they think back on these things when their minds are a bit clearer. Surely after Jesus rises from the dead, they're going to be able to process these things a bit better. All right. Well, the great thing about Matthew's greater focus on the disciples during the events at Gethsemane is that it provides us with a great lesson about discipleship. And this is where we're moving into my final heading, also my application for today, and why we should be bothering with any of this. Let's draw everything together with a final application. The humiliation of the disciples reinforces the necessity of prayer. Like if you take away anything from this, it is, keep watch and pray. Okay? Stay awake and pray. Christ himself makes this application. If we go here back to Matthew 26, verse 41, he says, "Keep watching and praying that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." So you're looking for your application. Jesus makes the application. So it's right there. You don't have to worry about not seeing it. It's right there. In times of temptation, or when we expect temptation, the chief remedy against the weakness of the flesh will always be prayer. It will always be drawing near to God and casting your cares on him and imploring him to be with you and to help you. Prayer is drawing near to God, talking with God, and partnering with God in all the matters of this life. It is comprehensive. It covers everything. If God is indeed our strength, our joy, our purpose, and our salvation, then you can never pray too much. And you can even argue that no amount of prayer is enough. You could argue that you could always do more. If you're going to arrange it for yourself, you can always pray more. And just as those disciples should have been praying rather than sleeping, we should pray. At any time when we sense the need for prayer, we should be doing that. In this case, Jesus specifically told them to pray. So they had no reason to doubt it. We don't necessarily have that, but I think we all sense our great need at times, and at those times we should be praying. In fact, we could say these events in Gethsemane were designed to reinforce the sweeping influence of prayer. There's more to it than just the events that we see here and the command Jesus gives in it. To some degree, the wording of it also underscores that, and I'll tell you what I mean here in a moment. This passage, the wording of this passage, maybe you've noticed this, maybe you've not noticed it. This passage echoes the model prayer given by Jesus to his disciples. There's a real sense in which the wording and some of the statements in this passage are even based on the passage teaching us to pray. And just for reference, I'll go ahead and read that to you from Matthew's Gospel. This is Matthew 6, verse 9. So this should be familiar. This is the way Jesus taught his disciples to pray. Matthew 6, verse 9, see this. "Pray then in this way, Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from evil." Maybe you saw some similarities between that passage and today's passage. In case you haven't seen all of them, let me just give you the bullet points. When Jesus prays in Gethsemane, he addresses God as Father, just like the model prayer. Our Father who is in heaven. And Jesus, when he prays, Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. So there's the way of praying there. And of course, that's usually how Jesus addresses God, but he does do it here too, just as in the model prayer. And what about this? Your will be done. That's one of the big phrases from the model prayer. Your will be done. That's how Jesus taught his disciples to pray back then. That's also how Jesus prays in the garden. Not my will, but your will be done. It's taken exactly from the prayer he gave his disciples as their way of learning how to pray. Finally, let's not forget this. Do not lead us into temptation. That's the ending of the model prayer. Do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And it also informs the command of Jesus to his disciples in the garden. Pray that you may not enter temptation. You're hitting these bullet points from the model prayer. Altogether, the lessons taught by Jesus for years to his disciples inform both the prayers and the commands of Jesus on the last night of his ministry. Keep talking about bookends. We have this prayer that he gave him at the very beginning of his ministry, and here at the very end, he's still reaching back to those things. He's practicing those things himself, and he's modeling them for his disciples. He's reminding his disciples of these things. Prayer is comprehensive. It covers everything. You never get away from this. You never get away from prayer as you think about the Christian life. Therefore, let's all be sure to pray. Let's be sure this is actually something we do. If there is any refrain or slogan among us with regard to the Christian life, it should be pray. It should be that's to be the one thing we keep ourselves doing. If there is any duty, however, that we tend to ignore or a blessing that we refuse, it is also prayer. It is perhaps the one thing that many people report. It's like, oh, I should be praying more. I really want to be keeping a prayer list and making sure I'm diligent in these things. Like all this kind of stuff that we do. It's like the one thing we neglect and the one thing we ought to be doing. Many Christians make the same mistake the disciples made in Gethsemane, sleeping instead of praying, either because they do not awaken early enough in the day to pray, or because they would rather go to bed early than pray. It's very often the same thing. They just don't block out that time there for prayer. They instead, sleep or occupy themselves with something else. Very common problem, and something that we have to get past. If you're going to grow as a Christian, you have to grow beyond that. And you have to make yourself pray. You have to make yourself draw near to God in the way that Jesus was commanding his disciples to do. But make no mistake, if you're not a praying Christian, you will be a humiliated Christian at every turn of your life, just like these three men in Gethsemane. You might have an experience where perhaps not bodily, but Jesus might come to you and say, "Are you still sleeping?" It's like, "Why aren't you praying? Like, this is the thing you should be doing right now." You don't want that. You don't want a situation in which you think back and look, I should have been praying for those things, or I should have been praying for myself, should have been praying for this guy. You don't want a situation where you realize you should have been praying and you didn't pray. One of the more humiliating moments that I have in my life that recurs somewhat often, hopefully less and less as time has gone on, when God does something really good for me and I realize I never prayed for that. It's like God just did that for me. I never asked him to do that. And, that just makes me feel like this tall when that happens, because man, I should have been praying for that. And then I could say God answers prayer, right? I could use it as argument in this sermon right now. It's like, hey, God answers prayer. I've got proof here, here, and here. Instead, I wasn't praying and God was just good to me anyway. It's humiliating when he does that. And I think he does it for a reason, to remind me, hey, if you should be praying, maybe you should start praying more. It's something that we very much have to get to and do as Christians. We're never going to get beyond that basic duty of prayer, and we're never going to be beyond the need of it. We're always going to have need of the spiritual help that comes through prayer. Well, let's bring this to a close here today. You would think that bearing the weight of the sins of the world would be enough, and that thinking of anything else would be impossible. Jesus there beginning to sweat blood and just feel the press of all the guilt of mankind on him, and the knowledge that his Father's about to forsake him, and he's going to die in that kind of state. You would think that would be enough, and his brain would be focused entirely on that. But Christ proves us wrong yet again by remaining a dedicated teacher right up to the point where his disciples would run and hide, leaving him to die. Even up to that point, he is still working for their good and still trying to convey to them such things as they need to know. And my point today was that Jesus uses his own humiliation as an occasion to correct his disciples, to humiliate them, yes, but also to teach them lessons that they are going to learn and which they are going to put into practice not many weeks from this point. Because several weeks from this point, excuse me, they're going to be very different men. And they're going to be living out these things much more powerfully. But that happened because Jesus was such a dutiful teacher, and even up to this point, he is working for their good. So I call that a helpful humiliation. Right? And I made that point in just a few steps. I'll tell you those again as a summary, and then we'll be done with the sermon for today. I first of all remarked that the garden is a place of potential sin and proven righteousness, and I was making the contrast between the Garden of Eden and the Garden of Gethsemane. And then secondly, I said Matthew portrays a contrast between a humiliated but resolute Jesus and boastful but weak disciples. So the way Matthew writes this, he very much wants you thinking about both parties, both Jesus and the disciples, to make a contrast between them. And my third heading was kind of part of that contrast, that Christ was further humiliated by his unhelpful disciples. Here they are to be with him, to comfort him. Instead, they fail. Jesus is striving more than ever before, but they fail him and fall asleep and do not provide the kind of comfort that he wanted them to give him at this time. And then in my fourth heading, I said that as Jesus prays, he also helpfully humiliates those same three disciples, showing them that despite their boastful attitudes, they aren't that great, and they need to know that they aren't that great so they can someday become greater than they are. And then finally, I just said that the humiliation of the disciples reinforces the necessity of prayer. Just as they needed to stay awake and pray, we need to stay awake and pray. We need to be seeking the Lord at all times in the way that they should have been. All right. Well, that is all I had for today, and that is the last sermon I had on this particular passage. So next time when I teach in Matthew, we'll be getting into the actual arrest of Jesus. Judas shows up, and we'll be talking more specifically about those things. So that will be the next time I teach. Are there any questions or comments about any of this